The Red Chamber, Edogawa Ranpo. Seven stern-looking men, I was one of them, gathered in the Red Chamber, specially prepared for this purpose, leaned back in deep, crimson velvet-covered armchairs, eagerly awaiting the evening storyteller to begin some strange tale. In the center of the seven men, on a large round table also covered in crimson velvet, three thick candles flickered faintly, placed in antique, carved candlesticks. Around the room from ceiling to floor, without even windows or doors, hung heavy crimson drapery in rich folds. The romantic candlelight cast our seven unusually large shadows on the dark, almost blood-like drapery of the drapery. And the shadow following the candle flame crawled along the curves of the folds of the hanging silk, stretching and contracting like several gigantic insects. As always, the room made me feel as if I were sitting inside the heart of an immeasurably large creature. I could almost hear the heart beating with a slowness befitting its size. No one spoke. I held the candle up to the light and gazed aimlessly at the dark, red, shadowy faces of the people seated on the other side. Strangely, those faces seemed expressionless, motionless, like no masks. Soon Mr. T, the new member chosen to speak that evening, remained seated, gazing intently at the candle flame, and began to speak as follows. I watched his jaw, which in the shadows made it look like a skeleton's, trembling sadly with each word he spoke, as if I were watching a strange, mechanically operated living doll. I consider myself sane, and others treat me that way, but I don't really know if I am. Perhaps I'm insane. Even if not that extreme, I might be suffering from some kind of mental illness. In any case, I find this world strangely boring. Just being alive is incredibly tedious. At first, however, I indulged in various hobbies like everyone else, but none of them soothed my inherent boredom. Instead, they only left me with disappointment, a feeling that this was the end of all interesting things in the world, and that it was all so dull. And so, gradually, I became reluctant to do anything. For example, when I heard about a certain game that was fun and would surely excite me, instead of being excited and thinking, oh, there's such a thing, I'll try it right away, I would first imagine all sorts of fun things about it in my mind. And after all that imagining, I would always end up disappointed, thinking, well, it's nothing special. In this way, for a while, I literally did nothing, spending my days just eating, waking up, and sleeping. And I would let all sorts of fantasies run through my mind, criticizing everything as boring and dull, living a life that was more painful than death, yet outwardly incredibly easy. If I were in a situation where I was just trying to make ends meet, that would have been better. Even if it was forced labor, as long as I had something to do, I would be happy. Or perhaps it would have been better if I were exceptionally wealthy. I could surely have indulged in the magnificent luxuries, sleazy games, and various other pleasures that historical tyrants enjoyed. But of course, since that is an impossible wish, I have no choice but to live each day in solitude and melancholy, like the lazy taro in the fairy tale, to the point where death would be preferable. If I say this, you will surely say, yes, yes, but we are no less bored with the world than you are. That's why we've created a club like this, trying to find some kind of abnormal excitement. You must be extremely bored, which is why you've joined us now. We already know how bored you are without having to ask again. And you're absolutely right. I didn't need to go on and on about boredom. And it was precisely because I thought you all knew so well what boredom was like that I decided to sit here tonight and share my strange life story. I frequented the restaurant downstairs quite often and naturally became friendly with the owner. I had known about this Red Chamber Club for quite some time and had even been encouraged to join several times. Despite all that, I, a bored person who would normally jump at such an offer without hesitation, hadn't joined until today because, and I apologize if this sounds rude, I was far more bored than any of you. I was, deep down, extremely bored. You are fortunate to still have some interest in crime, detective games, seances and other psychic experiments, obscene pictures and performances, and other sensual pastimes, visits to prisons, mad hospitals, and anatomy classrooms. I was not surprised at all when I heard that you were planning to spy on executions. This is because by the time your husband told me about it, I was not only utterly bored with such commonplace stimuli, but I had discovered a truly wonderful game. Though calling it a game might sound a little frightening, and I was completely engrossed in its pleasure. This game, if I tell you suddenly might shock you, is murder. Real murder. Moreover, since discovering that game, I have taken the lives of nearly 100 men, women, and children solely for the purpose of alleviating boredom. You might mistakenly assume that I am now repenting for this terrible sin and about to confess, but that is absolutely not the case. I feel no remorse whatsoever. I am not afraid of the sins I have committed. On the contrary, oh my goodness. Lately I have grown weary even of the bloody thrill of murder. And so, I have begun to indulge in something that will kill not others, but myself. Opium smoking. Even I, it seems, valued my life, and I have endured this for a long time. But now that I have grown weary of even murder, what other thrill can I seek besides plotting suicide? I believe I will soon lose my life to the poison of opium. Thinking this, I want to confide in someone about what I've been through, while I can still speak coherently. Wouldn't the people in this red chamber be the most suitable for that? That's why, in fact, I wasn't invited to join your group because I wanted to become a member, but simply because I wanted you to hear my strange story. And fortunately, it was a rule that new members must give a speech related to the group's purpose on their first night. So I was able to seize this opportunity tonight to fulfill my wish. That was roughly 3 years ago. At that time, as I mentioned earlier, I was utterly bored with all kinds of stimulation and had no purpose in life. Like an animal named boredom, I drifted through my days aimlessly. But that spring, though it was still cold, so it must have been the end of February or the beginning of March, one night I encountered a strange incident. The events of that night were what led me to take the lives of nearly 100 people. I had stayed up late somewhere, and it must have been around 1 a.m. I think I was a little drunk. Despite the cold night, I was strolling home without getting into my car. I casually turned into the side street, which was about 100 meters from my house, and bumped into a man who seemed flustered and rushing towards me. I was surprised, but the man seemed even more surprised, standing there silently for a while. Then as he spotted me in the faint light of a street lamp, he suddenly asked, "Is there a doctor around here?" Listening carefully, I learned that the man was a driver who had just hit an elderly man, who, given that he was wandering around alone at this time of night, was probably a vagrant, and severely injured him. Sure enough, looking about 4 or 5 meters away, there was a car parked, and beside it, a person was lying, faintly groaning. The nearest police station was quite far away, and the injured man was in terrible pain, so the driver must have been trying to find a doctor first and foremost. Since I was familiar with the area, being near my home, I knew the location of clinics well, so I immediately told him the following. If you go about 200 meters to the left from here, you'll see a house with a red lantern on the left. It's called M Clinic. You should go there and wake up the doctor. Then the driver immediately had his assistant help him, and they carried the injured man towards M Clinic. I watched them until their figures disappeared into the darkness, but I thought it was pointless to be involved in such a thing, so I went home. I'm single. I got into the bed the maid had laid out for me, and perhaps because I was drunk, I fell asleep much faster than usual. It was really nothing. In reality, it was nothing. If I had simply forgotten about the incident, that would have been the end of it. However, when I woke the next day, I still remembered the little incident from the previous night, and I started thinking about unnecessary things, like whether the injured man had survived. Then I suddenly realized something strange. Oh, I've made a terrible mistake. I was shocked. Even though I was drunk, I wasn't completely out of my mind. So what on earth was I thinking, having that injured man carried to M Clinic? If you go about 200 meters to the left from here, you'll see a house with a red lantern on the left. I still remember those words perfectly. Why didn't I say instead, if you go about 100 meters to the right from here, there's a surgical specialist at K Hospital. The M doctor I told him about was notorious for being a quack, and I even doubted whether he was capable of surgery at all. However, in the opposite direction from M, and much closer, there was a perfectly equipped surgical hospital called K. Of course, I should have known that very well. Why did I give the wrong information to the other person, even though I knew the truth? I still don't fully understand my strange psychological state at that time, but perhaps it was a case of lapsed memory. I became a little worried, so I had my nanny subtly investigate the neighborhood rumors, and it seemed the injured person had died in the examination room of M Clinic. No doctor would want to be brought in with such injuries, especially since it was 1 a.m. It's understandable. But apparently, no matter how much they knocked on the door, M Clinic refused to open it, making all sorts of excuses. By the time they finally brought in the injured person, after keeping them waiting for so long, it must have been far too late. However, if the doctor at M Clinic had instructed them, "I'm not a specialist, take him to the nearby K hospital," perhaps the injured person could have been saved. But what a reckless thing to do. He apparently tried to handle the difficult patient himself, and he failed. According to rumors, Dr. M panicked and treated the injured man for an unjustly long time. Hearing this, I felt a strange feeling. In this case, who is truly responsible for the death of the poor old man? Needless to say, both the driver and Dr. M bear responsibility, and if there is any legal punishment, it will probably be for the driver's negligence. But in reality, wasn't I the one most critically responsible? If I had told him to go to K Hospital instead of M Clinic, the injured man might have been saved without a single mistake. The driver only caused the injury. He didn't kill him. Dr. M failed because of his inferior medical skills, so he's not entirely to blame either. Even if he bears some responsibility, the root cause lies with me for giving him unsuitable directions to M Clinic. In other words, depending on my instructions at that time, I could have saved or killed the old man. It's certainly the driver who caused the injury. But wasn't it I who killed him? This is assuming my instructions were entirely accidental. But what if it wasn't an accident, but rather my intention to kill the old man? Needless to say, I would have effectively committed murder. However, while the law might punish the driver, it probably wouldn't even cast a suspicion on me, the de facto murderer. Because it's clear that I had absolutely no connection to the deceased old man. And even if I were suspected, I could simply say I'd forgotten about the surgical clinic. It's entirely a matter of my own conscience. Have you ever considered this kind of murder method? I only realized this after this car case, but when I think about it, what an incredibly dangerous place this world is. You never know when a man like me might, for no reason at all, intentionally give wrong advice about a doctor and end up unjustly losing a life that could have been saved. This is something I later tried and succeeded at. Imagine an elderly woman in the countryside about to cross the train tracks with one foot on the tracks. Of course, there are not only trains but also cars, bicycles, carriages, and rickshaws weaving together, so her mind must be quite confused. Let's assume that at the very moment she puts one foot on the tracks, an express train or something similar comes speeding towards her within 10 meters. If the old woman were to cross the tracks without noticing, there would be no problem. However, if someone were to yell loudly, "Watch out, Grandma," she would immediately panic, hesitating for a moment, wondering whether to continue or turn back. And if the train was too close to stop immediately, that single phrase, "Watch out, Grandma," could seriously injure her, and in the worst case, even take her life. As I mentioned earlier, I once successfully killed a country bumpkin using this method. Mr. T paused here, then laughed eerily. In this case, I, who yelled "Watch out," am clearly a murderer. But who would doubt my intent to kill? Would anyone imagine a man attempting to kill a complete stranger, someone he holds no grudge against, simply out of a morbid curiosity? Furthermore, the warning, "Watch out," can only be interpreted as a kind gesture. On the surface, the victim would be grateful, not resentful. Isn't this an incredibly safe method of murder? People in society foolishly believe that evil deeds always violate the law and result in appropriate punishment, and they feel completely secure. No one would imagine that the law would overlook murder. But consider this. As the two examples I just mentioned illustrate, there are countless methods of murder that show absolutely no regard for breaking the law. When I realized this, rather than shuddering at the horrors of the world, I was overjoyed by the Creator's generosity in leaving room for such guilt. I was truly ecstatic at this discovery. How wonderful! This way I can, in a sense, be the only one to carry out the execution without facing any consequences. Therefore, I conceived the idea of using this kind of murder to alleviate that unbearable boredom. Murder that absolutely does not violate the law. Murder that even Sherlock Holmes could not uncover. Oh, what a perfect way to wake myself up. For 3 years thereafter, I indulged in the pleasure of killing, and before I knew it, I had completely forgotten my boredom. Don't laugh, everyone. Like a warrior from the Sengoku period, I didn't literally kill 100 people, but I swore to myself that I would never stop this killing until I had taken 100 lives. About 3 months ago, I had killed exactly 99 people, and when I was down to the last one, as I mentioned earlier, I had grown tired of killing that person. But that aside, how did I kill those 99 people? Of course, I didn't hold any grudge against any of the 99 people. I was simply interested in the methods and results of killing them in secret, so I never repeated the same method even once. After killing one person, thinking about what new methods I could use to kill someone next became another source of enjoyment for me. However, I don't have time to recount all 99 different methods of killing here, and besides, I didn't come here tonight to confess those individual methods of murder. I have committed such heinous crimes in an attempt to escape boredom, and now, having grown weary even of those crimes, I am seeking your judgment on my unusual state of mind. Therefore, I will limit myself to mentioning only a few examples of my methods of murder. Shortly after I discovered this method, the following incident occurred. There was a masseur in my neighborhood who was incredibly stubborn. Whenever someone kindly offered him advice or warnings, he would take it the other way around, saying something like, "Don't think I'm blind and underestimate me. I know that much," and would always act contrary to what the other person said. His stubbornness was extraordinary. One day I was walking down a main street when I encountered this stubborn masseur coming towards me. He was walking along, humming a tune, with his cane slung over his shoulder. Construction for the sewage system had just begun in the town the day before, and a deep hole had been dug on one side of the street. Being blind, he couldn't see the signs indicating that one side was closed, so he was walking nonchalantly right next to the hole, completely unaware. Seeing this, a brilliant idea suddenly came to me, so I called out to the masseur by his name. "Hey, Mr. N!" We knew each other from his frequent visits for treatments. "Watch out, it's dangerous. Move to the left. Move to the left," I shouted. I did it deliberately in a slightly joking tone. This was because, given his usual nature, I figured he would surely misinterpret it as a prank and move to the right instead of the left. As expected, he, "Hehehe, you're joking," he replied in a playful tone, and suddenly took 2 or 3 steps to the right, stumbling into the sewer hole with one foot and falling 3 meters to the bottom in an instant. I pretended to be surprised and rushed to the edge of the hole. I wonder if he did well. I peered in, but he must have hit himself in the wrong place. He was lying limply at the bottom of the hole, probably struck by a sharp stone. Dark red blood was dripping from his short hair. Then it seemed he had bitten off his tongue, as blood was also coming from his mouth and nose. His face was pale, and he didn't even have the energy to groan. Thus this masseur, though barely alive for about a week, finally died. My plan was a resounding success. Who could possibly doubt me? I was a regular customer of this masseur, often calling upon him, and certainly had no grudge that would provide a motive for murder. Furthermore, outwardly, I was simply trying to avoid a trap on the right, telling him to move left, move left. While some might acknowledge my kindness, no one could possibly imagine that such a terrifying murderous intent lay beneath those seemingly helpful words. Ah, what a terrifying yet delightful game it was. The joy I felt upon devising the ingenious trick, perhaps comparable to that of an artist. The thrilling tension of executing it, the indescribable satisfaction upon achieving my goal. And then, the sight of my victims, men and women, unknowingly ravaged and throbbing in blood, unaware of the murderer before them. At first, how ecstatic those things made me. There was one time when something like this happened. It was a gloomy, overcast summer day, and I was walking through what you might call a suburban cultural village. I was walking through an area where about 10 Western-style houses were sparsely scattered, and just as I was passing the back of the most magnificent concrete Western-style house, something strange caught my eye. A sparrow, which had just flew past my nose with great speed, landed on a thick wire that was stretched from the roof of that house to the ground, and then suddenly bounced back down as if struck by lightning and died instantly. Thinking that was strange, I looked closer and realized that the wire was coming from a lightning rod standing on top of the pointed roof of the Western-style house. Of course, the wire was insulated, but for some reason, the insulation had peeled off where the sparrow had landed. I don't know much about electricity, but I remembered hearing somewhere that sometimes, due to the effects of atmospheric electricity, a strong current can flow through the wires of a lightning rod. I realized that this must be what was happening. It was the first time I'd ever encountered something like this, so I thought it was unusual and stopped for a while, gazing at the wires. Then a group of children, seemingly playing soldier or something, came out from the side of the Western-style building, making a lot of noise. One little boy, about 6 or 7 years old, stayed behind while the other children quickly went off. I watched to see what he would do. He stood on a small hill just in front of the lightning rod wires, rolled up his trousers, and began to urinate. Seeing this, I had yet another brilliant idea. I had learned in middle school that water is an electrical conductor. It would be easy for the child to urinate on the exposed part of the wire from the slightly elevated spot where he was standing. Urine is water, so it's undoubtedly a conductor. So I called out to the child, "Hey, little boy, try urinating on that wire. Can you reach it?" The child replied, "Oh, no problem, just watch." With that, he changed his posture and suddenly aimed the exposed part of the wire at the urinating section. And just as it was about to reach the wire, to my horror, the child jumped up as if dancing and then collapsed to the ground. I later learned that it's extremely rare for such a strong current to flow through a lightning rod, but that's how, for the first time in my life, I witnessed a person being electrocuted and killed. In this case, of course, I had no reason to fear being suspected. All I had to do was offer my sincere condolences to the mother who was clinging to her child's lifeless body and weeping, and then leave. This happened one summer. I had a friend I was aiming to sacrifice. Not that I held any grudge against him, but rather that we had been best friends for many years. However, I had a strange desire to turn such a close friend into a corpse, without a word, with a smile on my face, in an instant. I once went on a summer getaway with this friend to a remote fishing town in Boshu. Of course, it wasn't a proper beach. The only people splashing in the sea were the village's reddish-brown children. Besides the two of us, the only other visitors from the city were a few art students, who weren't even in the water, but rather wandering around the shore with their sketchbooks. Unlike well-known beaches where you can see the graceful bodies of city girls, the lodging was like a cheap Tokyo inn, and the food, aside from sashimi, was bland and unappetizing. It was a rather lonely and inconvenient place, but my friend, unlike me, enjoyed the solitude of such a rustic place, and I, on the other hand, was desperate to find an opportunity to get rid of this man, so I was able to settle down in that fishing town for a few days. One day I took my friend to a place quite far from the coastal village, a place that resembled a cliff. Then saying, "This is the perfect place for diving," I took the lead and took off my kimono. My friend, who had some swimming experience, said, "Yes, this is good," and followed my lead, taking off his kimono as well. So I stood on the edge of the cliff, stretched both arms straight above my head, shouted 1, 2, 3 loudly, and leaped up, drawing a magnificent arc as I plunged into the sea before me. The trick to diving is to quickly cut through the water with chest and belly breathing as your body splashes, diving only about 50 centimeters before resurfacing like a flying fish. I'd been a good swimmer since I was little, so diving was a piece of cake for me. With my head above the water, 30 meters from the shore, I treaded water, shook the water off my face with one hand, and called out to my friend, "Hey, you should try diving too." Of course, my friend didn't think anything of it, and saying okay, he assumed the same position as me and jumped in, following me with great force. However, after he dove into the sea, creating a splash, he didn't reappear for quite some time. I had anticipated this. There was a large rock about 2 meters above the surface at the bottom of the sea. I had scouted it out beforehand, and knowing my friend's skill level, I was certain that if he dived, he would dive more than 2 meters, and therefore hit his head on this rock. As you may know, the more skilled a diver is, the less they dive into this water. I was quite skilled at this, so I managed to surface before hitting the rock on the seabed. However, my friend was still a novice at diving, so he must have plunged headfirst into the seabed and hit his head hard against the rock. Sure enough, after waiting for a while, he floated to the surface like a dead tuna, and he was drifting with the waves. Needless to say, he was unconscious. I picked him up, swam to shore, and ran back to the village to tell the innkeepers what was happening. Their fishermen who had taken a break from fishing came and tended to my friend, but it must have been because he had suffered a severe blow to the brain. He had no hope of resuscitation. I saw that the top of his head was cut about 20 centimeters long, and the white flesh was swollen. On the ground where his head had been lying, there was a large amount of dried, dark red blood. I have only ever been questioned by the police twice, and this was one of those times. Since the incident happened in a place where no one was watching, it was only natural that I would be questioned. However, I knew that my friend and I were close friends and had never had a single argument before. Furthermore, the circumstances at the time were that neither he nor I knew there were rocks on the seabed. Fortunately, I was a good swimmer and managed to escape danger, but it became clear that he was a poor swimmer, which led to this unfortunate incident. Therefore, my name was easily cleared, and I even received words of condolence from the police, who said, "We are so sorry you lost a friend." No, if I were to list every single example like this, there would be no end to it. I think that with what I've said so far, you all probably understand my so-called lawless method of murder. It's all like this. Once I was among the circus spectators, and suddenly, in a bizarre and embarrassing posture, to say here, I distracted a female tightrope walker high up, causing her to fall. Furthermore, at a fire, I would suggest to a mother who was half crazed with rage, "Your child is sleeping inside the house. Can't you hear him crying?" and trick her into jumping into the raging flames, burning her to death. Or he would suddenly shout, "Wait!" from behind a girl who was about to throw herself into the water, startling her and causing her to jump in, which might have otherwise prevented her from doing so. There are countless other stories like these, but it's getting quite late, and I'm sure you all don't want to hear any more cruel tales, so I'll end with just one slightly unusual one. From what I've described so far, it might seem like I always killed one person at a time, but that wasn't always the case. Otherwise, I couldn't have killed 99 people in less than 3 years, and in a way that didn't violate any laws. The time I killed the largest number of people at once was, Yes, last spring. You probably read about it in the newspaper articles at the time. The train on the Chuo line derailed, resulting in many injuries and deaths. That's what I killed. It was a ridiculously simple method, but finding a place to carry it out took quite a bit of effort. However, I had my sights set on the Chuo line from the beginning. This line not only runs through the most convenient mountainous terrain for my plan, but also because the Chuo line is prone to accidents, a train derailment wouldn't attract as much attention as on other lines. It would just be seen as another one. Even so, finding the perfect location proved quite difficult. It took me a full week before I finally decided to use the cliff near M Station. There's a small hot spring resort near M Station, so I planned to stay at one of the inns there, bathing and strolling every day, trying to appear like a long-term spa goer. This meant wasting another 10 days or so, but eventually, feeling confident enough, I went for my usual walk along the mountain path. I reached the top of a small cliff about half a mile from the inn and waited there for dusk to fall. Below the cliff, the train tracks curved, and beyond the tracks, a deep, steep valley stretched out, with a small stream flowing at its bottom, visible in the distance, almost obscured by mist. After a while, the predetermined time arrived. Although no one was watching, I deliberately made myself look like I was stumbling slightly and kicked a large stone that I had found and placed beforehand. It was positioned so that with just a kick, it would surely roll down the cliff onto the railway tracks. I was prepared to try again with other stones if I missed, but to my surprise, the stone landed perfectly on one of the rails. A southbound train was scheduled to pass on those rails in a few tens of minutes. By then it would be completely dark, and since the stone was on the other side of a curve, the driver wouldn't notice it. Once I confirmed this, I hurried back to M Station, which took me over 30 minutes as it was several kilometers of mountain roads, and rushed into the station master's office, shouting in a panicked voice, "Something terrible has happened. I'm here for a hot spring cure, and I was just taking a walk up the cliff beside the railway tracks, about several kilometers away. As I was running down a slope, I accidentally kicked a stone down onto the tracks below. If a train were to pass there, it would surely derail. Worse, it could fall into the valley. I've tried to find a way to remove the stone, but since I'm unfamiliar with the mountains, I can't figure out how to get down that high cliff. So rather than just lingering, I rushed here. Would it be possible for you to remove it immediately?" I said, looking genuinely worried. The station master was surprised and said, "That's terrible. A southbound train just passed by. Normally, it would have already passed that area by now." That was exactly what I had hoped for. While this back and forth continued, a report arrived from the conductor of the southbound train, who had narrowly escaped the perilous situation and rushed to the scene, stating that the train had derailed and the number of casualties was unknown. It was a huge commotion. I was taken to the police station in M for the night, but I had thought through my work carefully. There was no way I could have made a mistake. Of course, I was severely reprimanded, but it wasn't something that warranted punishment. Later, I learned that my actions at the time didn't even fall under Article 129 of the Penal Code, which only carries a fine of 500 yen or less. And so, with a single stone, without being punished in the slightest, I succeeded in taking the lives of 17 people. Yes, 17. Everyone, I am the man who took the lives of 99 people in this way. I feel not a trace of regret. I'm already fed up with the bloody thrills, and now I'm about to sacrifice my own life. You all are frowning at my incredibly cruel actions. Yes, that's right. These are undoubtedly acts of heinous deeds, unimaginable to ordinary people. However, I hope you can understand, at least a little, the feelings I had, which led me to such unbearable boredom that I was willing to commit such heinous crimes to escape it. I could find no other purpose in life than to plot such evil deeds. I leave it to you all to judge. Am I a madman, or should I be called a murderous maniac? And so, tonight's speaker's incredibly bizarre and utterly strange life story came to an end. He looked around at each of our faces, the listeners with somewhat bloodshot, vacant eyes that resembled those of a madman. However, not a single person responded or raised an eyebrow in criticism. There, illuminated by the eerie, flickering light of a candle, stood 7 flushed faces, lined up without so much as a flicker. Suddenly, something gleamed on the drapery near the door. As I watched, the silvery object grew larger and larger. It was a round, silver object, emerging from between the red drapery, forming a circle, much like a full moon breaking through dense clouds. From the first moment, I knew it was the large silver tray carrying our drinks, held in the hands of a waitress. But strangely, the atmosphere of this red chamber, which inevitably transforms everything into a dreamlike illusion, made the ordinary silver tray seem like the one the slave thrusts out of the old well in Siloam, the one on which the prophet's severed head rests. And once the silver tray was fully exposed from behind the drapery, it seemed as if a broad, gleaming sword, like a Chinese broadsword, might suddenly emerge from it. But instead of the thick-lipped, half-naked slave, the usual beautiful waitress appeared. And as she began to briskly move among the 7 men, distributing drinks, it was as if the winds of the world had blown into this surreal, dreamlike room, creating a sense of disharmony. She seemed to drift around the restaurant downstairs, surrounded by the sounds of lively singing, dancing, revelry, and the lewd screams of young women. "There, I'm going to shoot you!" Suddenly, T said in a calm tone, no different from his usual speaking voice. Then, reaching into his pocket, he pulled out a glittering object and slowly pointed it towards the waitress. Our gasps, the bang of a pistol, and the woman's scream all happened almost simultaneously. Of course, we all rose from our seats at once. But oh, what a fortunate thing it was. The woman who had been shot was completely unharmed. She simply stood there, dazed before the horribly shattered drink. "Ha ha ha ha!" Mr. T began to laugh like a madman. "This is a toy. Ha ha ha. Hana, you were totally fooled." So the pistol, still emitting white smoke in Mr. T's right hand, was nothing more than a toy? "Wow, what a surprise! Is that a toy?" The waitress, who seemed to be familiar with Mr. T, though her lips were still colorless, said this as she approached him. "Let me see. Wow, it looks just like the real thing." She picked up the 6-shot toy, seemingly trying to hide her embarrassment, and examined it. But then, "I'm so annoyed, I'll shoot you too." With that, she bent her left arm, placed the muzzle of the pistol on it, and defiantly aimed it at Mr. T's chest. "If you can shoot me, go ahead," Mr. T said, grinning and teasing. "I can shoot." Bang! A gunshot, even sharper than before, echoed throughout the room. "Oh!" A strangely eerie groan rang out, and then Mr. T suddenly rose from his chair and collapsed onto the floor. He began flailing his arms and legs, writhing in agony. Was this a joke? His struggles were far too real to be a joke. We instinctively rushed to his side. One of us sitting next to him picked up a candlestick from the table and raised it above the writhing man. We saw Mr. T's pale face convulsing, his body stretching and contracting like a wounded earthworm wriggling, his muscles thrashing about in a frenzy. And from the dark-looking wound on his exposed chest, bright red blood trickled down his pale skin with every movement. The second round of the 6-shot revolver, which had appeared to be a toy, was actually loaded with live ammunition. We stood there blankly for a long time, none of us moving. This event, following the bizarre story, gave us an overwhelming urge. According to the clock, it may have been only a short time, but at least to me at that moment, the time we spent standing there doing nothing seemed very long. Because in that instant, faced with the suffering wounded man, I had ample time to formulate the following reasoning. This is certainly an unexpected turn of events. However, upon closer examination, isn't it possible that this was all part of Mr. T's program for the night from the very beginning? He killed 99 people, but perhaps he saved the 100th for himself. And perhaps he chose this red chamber, the most fitting place for such a thing, as his final resting place. Considering this man's extremely bizarre nature, this isn't entirely far-fetched speculation. Yes, the technique of making the waitress believe the pistol was a toy and then having her fire it, isn't that his unique method, common to his other murders? This way, the waitress, the culprit, wouldn't face any punishment. There are 6 of us witnesses here, meaning Mr. T applied the same method he used on others, a method that ensures the perpetrator faces no consequences to himself. The others around me also seemed lost in their own thoughts, and perhaps they were the same as mine. Indeed, in this case, there was no other way to think about it. A terrifying silence reigned in the room. Only the mournful sobs of the slumped waitress could be heard softly. Illuminated by the candlelight of the red chamber, this tragic scene seemed far too dreamlike to be an event of this world. Coo, 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 coo. Suddenly, another strange sound was heard, in addition to the woman's sobs. It seemed to be escaping from the mouth of Mr. T, who had stopped struggling and lay limply like a dead man. A chilling shiver ran up my spine. Coo, 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 coo. The sound grew louder and louder. And then, in a flash, Mr. T's dying body limply rose to its feet. Even after he stood up, the strange coo, 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 coo sound didn't stop. It sounded like a groan of pain squeezed from the depths of his chest. But, perhaps, oh, so that was it after all. Surprisingly, he had been silently suppressing an unbearable amusement from the very beginning. "Everyone," he shouted, now laughing loudly. "Everyone, do you understand this now?" Then, oh, what happened? The waitress, who had been weeping like that just moments before, suddenly stood up cheerfully, and as if unable to contain herself any longer, she bent her body into a V shape and burst into uncontrollable laughter. "This is," Mr. T then explained, holding a small cylindrical object in his palm before us, who were still taken aback. "It's a bullet made from a cow's bladder. It's filled with red ink, and when it hits its target, the ink flows out. And you know what? Just like this bullet is fake, my whole life story, from beginning to end, is a complete fabrication. I'm quite the actor, aren't I? Now, you bored folks, this probably doesn't provide the kind of excitement you're always craving." While he was revealing his trick, the waitress who had been assisting him must have quickly flipped a switch downstairs, because suddenly, a light as bright as midday flooded the room, blinding our eyes, and that bright white light instantly dispelled the dreamy atmosphere that had permeated the room. There, the exposed secret of the magic trick lay, its ugly corpse revealed. How shabby everything looked. The crimson drapes, the crimson carpet, the same tablecloths and armchairs, and even those meaningful-looking silver candlesticks. In the red chamber, no matter which corner you looked, there was no longer a trace of dreams, illusions, or even a shadow of them.
This concludes this story. Up until the last video on this channel, we have been using the spelling R-A-M-P-O for Ranpo. This was mainly because the first English translation of Ranpo's work used this spelling. However, his currently published works are spelled R-A-N-P-O, and Edgar Allan Poe, from whom Ranpo's pen name is derived, also uses an N instead of an M. Therefore, starting with this video, this channel will also adopt R-A-N-P-O. I will see you at the end of next month.